For 21 seasons, a man in a plaid shirt walked into a small workshop behind a Massachusetts farmhouse, put on his safety glasses, and built something from raw lumber, right in front of a camera that never blinked. No competitions. No countdown clocks. No manufactured conflict between contestants fighting for a prize. Just a craftsman, a bench full of tools, and a plan drawn out in his own hand. When the show ended in 2009, it wasn't struggling. It wasn't losing viewers. It was, by every normal measure, a success. And that's exactly why so many people were caught off guard when it stopped. The reason had nothing to do with ratings, money, or backstage drama. It had everything to do with what 21 years of real, physical work does to a real human body. To understand why the ending mattered so much, you have to understand what the show actually was, and how unusual that made it. The new Yankee Workshop premiered in 1989, the brainchild of producer Russell Morrish, who had already built a reputation with the long-running home renovation series, This Old House. Morrish had spent years watching his lead carpenter, Norm Abram, work on that show, and he noticed something that went beyond raw skill. Norm had a way of making complicated joinery feel within reach for someone who had never picked up a chisel in their life. He explained things without condescension. He moved without wasted motion. Morrish decided that talent deserved its own stage, so he built Norm a workshop of his own, tucked behind a farmhouse, stocked with everything a serious woodworker could ask for. The format rarely changed, and that consistency became part of its charm. Norm would introduce a project, often a piece with historical roots, like a blanket chest, a Windsor chair, or a Shaker side table. Sometimes he'd visit the original piece or a landmark connected to the style, examining its joinery and proportions before heading back to the shop. Then he'd build it from rough lumber to finished piece, narrating every decision as he went. There were no shortcuts shown off camera. If a joint didn't fit quite right, viewers watched him solve it in real time. Airing on PBS meant the show never had to chase ratings with stunts or manufacture tension. It ran counter to almost everything else on television at the time, and that turned out to be its greatest strength. There was something quietly restorative about watching a genuinely skilled person do their work without any pretense, and audiences responded to that in a way few executives would have predicted. By the early 1990s, the show had become something close to a Saturday morning ritual for households across the country. Over the course of its run, Norm built roughly 235 complete projects on screen, ranging from simple shop jigs to elaborate period furniture reproductions, outdoor structures, and even a boat. Woodworking clubs saw new memberships. Local hardware and tool retailers noticed spikes in weekend sales after new episodes aired. Instructors at woodworking schools regularly heard the same story from new students. They'd started because of something they saw Norm build on television. Without ever chasing influence, Norm Abram had become one of the most quietly significant figures in American craft for an entire generation. The audience only ever saw a tidy 22-minute episode. What they didn't see was the machinery required to produce it. Each project demanded somewhere between 40 and 60 hours of preparation and filming. That included sourcing the right species and dimensions of lumber, sometimes tracking down specific boards that fit the historical piece being reproduced. It meant working out in advance which steps of a build could be compressed for television and which needed to be shown step by step so the technique actually made sense. It meant coordinating camera angles, lighting, and tool placement so the final footage looked effortless. And at the center of that entire operation, Norm still had to build the piece for real, with real consequences if a cut went wrong. There were no stunt hands standing in for the difficult joinery. If a dovetail didn't seat properly, he fixed it himself on camera, the same way any woodworker would in their own shop. He had one assistant helping with cleanup and finishing work, but the actual craftsmanship that people tuned in to see belonged entirely to him. That authenticity is what gave the show its staying power. Experienced woodworkers could tell immediately that what they were watching was genuine skill, not a television performance of skill. And even viewers with no woodworking background could sense the difference between someone demonstrating a task and someone who had spent a lifetime mastering it. But that same authenticity came with a cost that rarely gets discussed. During production seasons, the show wasn't a side project. It was a full-time commitment, often 40 to 60 hours a week, running in parallel with his ongoing work on this old house. For years, Norm was effectively carrying two demanding television production schedules at once. The difference was in the weight each role carried. On this old house, he contributed as one voice among several. On the new Yankee Workshop, he was the designer, the builder, the teacher, and the host all at once. Every episode depended entirely on him showing up and doing the work from beginning to end. Then there was the physical setting itself. The workshop floor was bare concrete, and during active filming, Norm stood on it for long stretches most days, not for a single season, but across more than 2 decades. Cutting, lifting, bending, sanding, and repeating, day after day, year after year. On screen, the show felt unhurried and calm. Off-screen, it was a relentless physical grind that simply never made it into the final edit. By 2009, Norm Abram was approaching 60 years old, having spent 2 decades doing sustained physical labor in a shop built for craftsmanship, not comfort. The wear didn't arrive suddenly. It accumulated gradually, the way physical strain tends to, until it reached a point that was hard to keep ignoring. Years of repetitive sawing, chiseling, and sanding contributed to joint discomfort that became harder to manage over time. Long hours bent over workbenches and lifting heavy stock put steady strain on his back. And standing for extended hours on an unforgiving concrete floor year after year is exactly the kind of repeated stress that tends to catch up with a person eventually. None of it showed up on screen. Norm's on-air demeanor in the later seasons looked just as unhurried and precise as it had in the earliest ones. That was simply consistent with who he was. He wasn't inclined to let personal strain become part of the show's story. But privately, conversations had already started with producer Russell Morrish and the team at WGBH about what continuing the show would actually require going forward. The show wasn't failing. It was still profitable, still fully funded through underwriting, and still capable of running indefinitely from a business standpoint. The real question wasn't whether the format still worked. It clearly did. The question was what it would keep costing the one person the entire show depended on. When the ending finally came, it was Norm's decision. And that detail matters, because plenty of speculation followed in the years afterward. Some assumed a falling out behind the scenes. Others guessed at network pressure or declining viewership. None of that speculation held up. The people closest to the production were consistent on this point. There was no external push, no cancellation, and no falling out. The show ended because the man at the center of it chose to step back. Norm addressed it directly and briefly at the time, saying simply that the show had a great run, that it had produced challenging projects, introduced him to wonderful woodworkers, and earned loyal support from millions of viewers over the years. There was no list of grievances attached to that statement, just an acknowledgement that it was time to stop. Russell Morrish, who had overseen the show from its very first day of production, put it plainly when he spoke to the press afterward. The show couldn't continue without Norm. There wasn't a version of it that made sense with someone else standing at that workbench, and comparisons to any replacement would have been unavoidable and unfair. Morrish also made clear that the decision was mutual, and, in his own words, that Norm had earned the right to do a little less after 20 years of carrying that workload. The format wasn't something that could simply be handed off. It had always been one specific person doing one specific thing in one specific way, and that fact made a graceful handoff impossible even if anyone had wanted to attempt it. There was also a quieter, more personal thread running underneath the decision. Norm's own home, a timber-framed colonial he had built himself in Carlisle, Massachusetts, still had unfinished details he had never found time to complete, because so much of his energy each year went into producing the show. Ending, it wasn't a retreat from woodworking. It was making room to do it again on his own schedule, without a production calendar dictating every hour. On October 16, 2009, WGBH Boston made it official. No further episodes of the new Yankee Workshop would be produced. There was no farewell special and no dramatic send-off episode. It ended the same way Norm had always worked, without unnecessary ceremony, everything that needed to be said having already been said plainly. The announcement landed as a genuine surprise, even among long-time fans who understood that most long-running shows eventually wind down. What caught people off guard wasn't the ending itself, but the total absence of warning signs. There had been no dip in quality, no rumors of trouble, no farewell-tinged final season. The show had simply been doing what it always did, and then it stopped. Woodworking forums and message boards filled up almost immediately. Fine Woodworking magazine, which had covered the program throughout its run, later noted that the volume of reader response was unlike anything they'd seen for a television-related story. People weren't just disappointed to lose a program. Many described the loss in the same terms they might use for losing something woven into the actual rhythm of their week. Veteran woodworkers credited the show with reigniting a passion they'd nearly set aside. Beginners described how Norm's patient, unhurried instruction gave them the confidence to attempt their first real project. Teachers mentioned students who found their way into woodworking specifically because of something they'd seen on a Saturday morning broadcast. Parents recalled watching episodes with their kids, and those kids, grown into adults, still remembered which projects they had built or watched together. What that response revealed, more clearly than any ratings chart ever could, was that the show hadn't just entertained people for 2 decades. It had shaped how they spent their free time, what they valued, and how they thought about the act of making something with their own hands. That's a rare outcome for any television program, and rarer still for one that never relied on drama or self-promotion to get there. Notably, the reaction wasn't angry. It was closer to grief carried with respect. Even without knowing the specific physical toll behind the decision, most viewers seemed to sense that Norm had given the show everything he reasonably could, and that asking for more would have been unfair. The legacy of the new Yankee Workshop is difficult to measure precisely, in part because it never sought attention for itself while it was running. It didn't generate headlines or controversy. It simply showed up, week after week, for 21 seasons, and taught people how to build things properly. The 235 projects Norm completed on screen remain as useful today as they were when filmed. Shaker furniture, Windsor chairs, blanket chests, and period reproductions are not styles that go out of fashion, because they were never built around trends in the first place. They endure because they're honest pieces of furniture, built to last generations rather than to impress for a single season. Norm didn't just show people how to construct those pieces. He explained why the designs held up, which is a different and longer-lasting kind of education than simple technique. The measured drawings and project plans sold throughout the show's run gave viewers a direct path from watching to building. Many of those exact projects still exist in homes today, some now passed down to a second generation of owners, physical proof that a Saturday morning television program left something tangible behind. In January 2023, more than 13 years after production ended, Russell Morrish announced that the full archive of episodes was available to stream for free online. The response was immediate. A new audience, many of them decades younger than the show's original viewers, discovered Norm Abram for the first time and reacted with the same quiet admiration earlier generations had. People described staying up late finishing episodes back-to-back, buying their first set of hand tools after watching a single build, and finding the show unexpectedly calming in a way little else on the internet managed to be. More than a decade off the air, it was still doing exactly what it had always done, making people want to go build something themselves. Stepping away from the new Yankee Workshop didn't mean stepping away from woodworking or television altogether. Norm continued appearing on This Old House, where his role as master carpenter came with a far more sustainable pace. Rather than carrying an entire production on his own, he contributed expertise in a supporting capacity, staying connected to both the craft and the audience without the physical demands the other show had required. For the first time in years, he also had room to work on his own projects. His timber-framed colonial in Carlisle finally got the attention it had been waiting for, without a filming schedule competing for his time. He continued writing about woodworking, keeping the same clear, practical style that had defined his years on camera. In 2016, he appeared in Felled, a documentary about repurposing fallen urban trees, a subject that fit naturally with how he'd always approached wood, not simply as material, but as something with history worth respecting. In 2022, after more than 4 decades on television, Norm officially retired from this old house as well. The send-off matched everything else about his career: understated, respectful, and free of spectacle. The original workshop still stands today, and Norm still visits from time to time, not to film and not to perform, just to build. Strip away the speculation. And the reason the new Yankee Workshop ended is straightforward. Norm Abram gave the show everything he had for 21 years, without ever trying to make himself the center of attention beyond the work itself. When his body finally signaled that it had reached its limit, he listened to it instead of pushing through for one more profitable season. There was no prolonged goodbye tour and no dramatic final chapter. He simply stepped back and kept doing what he'd always done: building and fixing things, just without a production crew documenting every hour of it. And in an industry that often rewards noise over substance, that quiet consistency is a large part of why his influence never really faded. It's still visible in every clean joint cut by someone who learned from watching him, and in every person who picked up a chisel for the first time because a man in a plaid shirt made careful, honest craftsmanship look worth pursuing.